Hoy, en Alas, volamos en The Discovery Channel con el F-105 Thunder Chief. Conocido comúnmente como el Thud o el Duro, fue el bombardero monomotor más grande que se produjo. Este bombardero supersónico de largo alcance se diseñó para llevar cargas pesadas de bombas nucleares o convencionales. El poder de fuego del Thunder Chief, su velocidad y su confiabilidad hicieron de él un arma altamente efectiva en la época de Vietnam. Hoy, en Alas, volamos alto en el F-105 Thunder Chief. Alas. Este es un F-105G, la versión salvaje del Thunder Chief. La última variación de un avión que cuando se produjo por primera vez era el monomotor más grande y de una sola silla jamás construido. El F-105 fue un arma aterradoramente poderosa en los cielos de Vietnam y se convirtió en lo que se conociera como el duro de la Fuerza Aérea. El diseñador del F-105 fue Alexander Carver, diseñador jefe de Republic, y bastante familiarizado con el concepto de bombarderos grandes. Él había diseñado el P-47 Thunderbolt durante la Segunda Guerra Mundial, el monomotor más grande en su época, que se produjo en gran cantidad y demostró ser un caballo de trabajo, no solo en su papel como escolta de bombarderos, sino como bombardero en misiones de apoyo táctico. Los trabajos en el proyecto Avanzado 63, la serie de estudios de diseños que condujeron al F-105, comenzaron en 1951 en medio del fragor de la Guerra de Corea. Básicamente era una actualización con recursos particulares del F-84 de Republic. El F-84 se había desarrollado como un jet Thunderbolt para funciones tácticas y de escolta. En Corea demostró no ser competitivo con el MiG-15, pero se había desempeñado bien en el ataque a tierra. Las alas rectas del F-84 hacían parte de un diseño bastante convencional y sus últimas manifestaciones exhibieron alas de barrido, más apropiadas para la velocidad potencial del jet. Pero con la experiencia de Corea y el ritmo rápido en los desarrollos tecnológicos, muy pronto el equipo de diseño se dio cuenta de que tendría que producir un avión completamente nuevo. Cuando el equipo de Republic empezó su proyecto, su contraparte, la North American Company, acababa de recibir apoyo de la Fuerza Aérea Norteamericana para el F-100 Super Sabre. Este sería el primero de una serie de aviones conocidos como los bombarderos del siglo, que cubrirían el papel de multibombardero, con lo cual se hizo obvio que la Fuerza Aérea se movía rápidamente hacia la capacidad supersónica. Su vida comenzó como un reciclaje del exitoso F-86 Sabre, y desde el comienzo el F-100 se describió como un bombardero de superioridad aérea, pero su última variante añadía el potencial de un cazabombardero. Con una velocidad máxima de 1.376 kilómetros por hora, el Hawk fue el primer bombardero supersónico de la Fuerza Aérea y llegaría a demostrar su valor particularmente en el papel de apoyo táctico en Vietnam. El siguiente fue el McDonnell F-101 Voodoo, diseñado como bombardero de penetración y escolta. El rápido desarrollo de la aviación puede apreciarse en el hecho de que el F-101, que se ordenó solo 12 meses después del F-100, tenía una velocidad máxima de 1.760 kilómetros por hora. De nuevo, el avión desarrolló capacidad táctica en los modelos posteriores y se utilizó en forma extensiva en Vietnam, sobre todo en reconocimiento fotográfico. El tercero en la serie de bombarderos del siglo fue el F-102 Delta Dagger de General Dynamics, un interceptor para cualquier estado del clima. Este se había iniciado en 1950. Con una capacidad de 1.300 kilómetros por hora, tuvo un éxito relativo que sería superado por el F-106, el cual alcanzaba una velocidad máxima de 2.400 kilómetros por hora. El F-104 Starfighter de la Lockheed, ordenado en marzo de 1953, buscaba a cualquier costo el desempeño como bombardero para la superioridad aérea. Funcionando básicamente como un misil dirigido, el F-104 tuvo una carrera diversificada y demostró una longevidad sorprendente como avión de ataque y reconocimiento. En Republic, el equipo de Carvelli, que trabajaba en el proyecto avanzado 63, después de un programa que alcanzó 108 configuraciones, propuso un diseño para un bombardero táctico monomotor de una sola silla, con capacidad para llevar armas nucleares en un compartimiento interior. En septiembre de 1952, la Fuerza Aérea le dio su aprobación al F-105A, con la intención de producirlo en masa, pero al final se construyeron solo 2 ejemplares. El F-105 fue el primero de los bombarderos de siglo ordenado por la Fuerza Aérea con propósitos de ataque táctico. La percepción de la necesidad de ese avión resultó tanto de la experiencia en los campos de batalla de Corea y de la competencia geopolítica, como del interior de los servicios de comandos estratégico y táctico de la Fuerza Aérea. Además de la ampliación de los parámetros operacionales, el F-105 ofrecía la capacidad de llevar armas nucleares de largo alcance con el aumento correspondiente en su prestigio, que rivalizaba con el del Comando Aéreo Estratégico. El apoyo del Comando Táctico Aéreo al F-105 llegó a ser vital para el proyecto ante las dificultades de los primeros años. Toda la tecnología en ingeniería de aviación se estaba revolucionando como respuesta a la enorme cantidad de desafíos inherentes a la transición.
And the F-105 was to have plenty of developmental problems in the years ahead. But what made the huge fighter so special was its large internal capacity. The atom bombs, more reminiscent of drums than weapons, gave it a potency far beyond any competitor. For the F-105A, significant breakthroughs in understanding the effects of transonic drag, together with some inherent deficiencies, had already seen the design superseded. It first flew over 3 years after the USAF go-ahead, and by then, its internal systems had changed beyond recognition. Also by then, manufacture of its replacement was underway. The third F-105 was the first of the B model. We see it here on the 26th of May 1956 as it taxis to its takeoff point for its first flight. This was the first 105 to have a power plant big enough to match its size, and major external changes had also been incorporated, chief among which was the area ruling, which had rescued the F-102 from its drag and turbulence problems. This had replaced the straight lines of the A model with a slim hip over the wing. A massive 4-petaled air brake now dominated the previously clean lines of the engine exhaust, and there had also been changes made to the air intakes, giving the Thunder Chief its characteristic nostrils. A larger tail area had increased stability. These and other changes had resulted in a plane with the capacity to double the speed of sound.
Quizás simbólicamente, el primer vuelo se vio rodeado de circunstancias casi fatales. Se daba por entendido que el vuelo sería corto, algo así como un circuito rápido. Pero cuando llegó el momento de bajar las llantas, no hubo respuesta de la llanta de la nariz. El hecho de elevar y bajar el embrague principal no surtía efecto. La llanta no salía. En lugar de abandonar el avión, se decidió intentar un aterrizaje con las llantas arriba, de manera que el piloto de prueba hizo un descenso prolongado y peligroso de gran valor. Eventualmente el avión se detuvo y la tripulación de emergencia se agrupó en torno al polvo que se levantó. Este tipo de aterrizaje solo produjo una enorme vergüenza para un proyecto que había sido cuestionado por su excesivo costo y por los problemas mecánicos. Sin embargo, aún era posible arguir que los problemas se estaban resolviendo con sistemas que mejoraban considerablemente el desempeño general del avión. Incluso como programa de prueba, el F-105 estaba revolucionando no solamente la ciencia de la aviación, sino el potencial de la aviación táctica. La causa del accidente se identificó en los nuevos controles del ingreso de aire que, al ser sometidos a altos esfuerzos, trababan la llanta, algo sencillo de corregir.
One other thing that the crash demonstrated was something that those who flew the Thunder Chief in action came to know and approve of, its toughness. The plane was lifted, the undercarriage was lowered, and the prototype was towed away to be mended.
Reconstruido, se reintegró al programa de pruebas a medida que avanzaba el trabajo de unir todos los sistemas y sacar los problemas de los componentes. Los ingenieros confrontaban conceptos y fuerzas que escasamente podían controlar y superaban los problemas cuando aparecían. Es difícil pensar en otra manera, teórica o práctica, de enfrentar esos problemas en medio del intenso revuelto de desarrollo tecnológico. Siendo el primer avión capaz de atacar hacia el aire y hacia la tierra con armas de entrega semiautomática, el Thunder Chief se apoyaba en paquetes aviónicos más avanzados que cualquier otro en el momento. Entre estas facilidades estaban los modelos de radar para el reconocimiento aéreo, el mapeo del contorno, seguimiento en tierra y persecución automática de blancos aéreos o terrestres, incluso en condiciones de visibilidad nula. Durante su vida, el F-105 constantemente recibiría sistemas nuevos y actualizados, pero incluso desde el primer ejemplar fue un avión muy avanzado para su tiempo.
The rebuilt plane was allocated to conduct the spin testing program, and a spin recovery parachute was installed on the tail of the plane. This required removing a panel to afford room for the chute and removing the air brake so that, if needed, the chute would be unimpeded. Trials on the chute demonstrated that it worked satisfactorily. The aim of spin testing is to ensure that a plane can be recovered from a spin to normal flight, that once control has been lost, it can be regained. Of course, the first thing to do in such a test is to lose control of the aircraft deliberately. Then the test pilot sits there while his plane plummets through the air for a specified duration, and then he attempts recovery. This is not work for the faint-hearted. The emergency spin recovery parachute was not needed, as the planes proved to have a natural tendency to level out after each revolution, and the pilots were able to resume control fairly easily. However, the airframe still had to be tested, and so the trials went on. 47 times, the pilots let go and watched the horizon slide away sickeningly as the plane commenced its fall. If you look carefully here, you'll see a pillar of flame leap from the tail of the plane as the engine stalls. Though the flight tests proceeded well, the technical problems persisted, with the engine and the avionics still unreliable. The uncertainty of performance was matched by a wider uncertainty about the future of the plane. The original expectation of large production had been amended to 37, then cancelled altogether in December 1953. A reinstated order in February 1954 was for 15 aircraft, but by September this had been cut back to 3. In October, it was back to 6. Parallel to this state of flux, the operational requirements for the new fighter had already been repeatedly amended before being first published in December 1954, and by April 1955 had been changed 3 more times. The men conducting the test series went on with their work, while uncertainty continued to shroud the future of the project. The 105's already
El alcance del F-105 se incrementó con la adición de tanques externos de combustible, los cuales también tenían que probarse, entre otras cosas, para establecer el efecto que tenían en el avión. Durante 1957 continuaron las pruebas sobre el desierto a medida que el avión sufría numerosas modificaciones. Las evaluaciones previas al servicio, que estaban previstas para noviembre de 1959, continuaron hasta marzo de 1960. Una de las especificaciones que se adicionaron en 1954 era que el F-105 debería poder reabastecerse de combustible durante el vuelo, innovación que ya se usaba en gran medida. Con un avión como el F-105, esta era una proposición truculenta, porque cuando el piloto del bombardero disminuía a la misma velocidad que el tanquero, perdía el flujo de aire sobre las alas indispensable para mantenerse a nivel. La velocidad máxima del tanquero y la más baja del F-105 eran muy aproximadas. El bombardero es muy difícil de maniobrar a esa velocidad, especialmente en la turbulencia del avión más grande, y a veces disminuye completamente su velocidad.
Attempts to alleviate the problem by adding jets to the tankers, as here to a B-29, didn't help all that much.
Los intentos de aliviar el problema adicionando turbinas a los tanqueros, como aquí en el B-29, no ayudaron mucho. Todos los bombarderos supersónicos tenían el mismo problema hasta cuando los tanqueros de turbinas incrementaron la velocidad del abastecimiento, logrando niveles más seguros. Las pruebas confirmaron la dificultad para el piloto. No obstante haber logrado abastecimientos exitosos, el sistema seguía siendo poco práctico, no por fallas en el F-105, sino por lo inadecuado de los tanqueros. Con la cola flotante en el tope del ala, más bien que en la cola del avión, se sacó la operación de lo peor de la turbulencia de los aviones más grandes y de alguna manera se facilitaron las cosas. La larga manguera de la cola flotante no facilitaba las cosas porque obligaba al piloto del bombardero a maniobrar sobre la cola. Solamente cuando se cambió el sistema a que el piloto del bombardero sostuviera su posición en relación con el tanquero y el operador en el tanquero dirigiera la conexión, se logró que el reabastecimiento fuera un asunto práctico. El F-105 tenía dos tipos de conexiones para el reaprovisionamiento y ambos serían muy utilizados durante la carrera del Thunder.
Back at the end of 1954, Republic must have been wondering about the fate of the 105, and their anxiety can have only been slightly alleviated by the bittersweet news they received in February 1955. The order was lifted back to 15, with allowance for the rest of the original 34 only if funds were available in the coming fiscal year. To add to this ambiguous news was the unsettling proviso that there be a fly-off against the North American company's F-107, an updated, high-powered and re-equipped Super Sabre variant. The 107 has been described as the best fighter never to be bought by the USAF, and it was certainly a potent plane. With the same engine as the Thunder Chief, it was an extremely advanced and powerful design and offered comparable performance. However, in the vital TAC interest in stores, carriage and delivery, it fell behind the 105, and the contest could be seen as a bit of a non-event. Had the 107 been compared to almost any other plane at that time, it may have outperformed it. However, the 105 was a rather special opponent, and the performance of the controversial big plane was beginning to quell the doubts about its worth. The revisions of the Thunder Chief's specifications had continued in a stream of expansions of its system's capability. Constant electronic renovation proceeded throughout the plane's development and its operational lifetime, continuing to maintain the 105 at the forefront of performance. The plethora of design changes meant that the first 15 105s produced represented 5 distinct subtypes. Eventually, there were to be 19. During the testing program, of course, the revisions of the plane meant that the trials were regularly extended. The normal flight testing programs were consistently completed with little trouble, as the airframe behaved very well and had admirable flight characteristics. However, The electronics of the newly conceived and developing systems caused continuing delays as their performance was lifted to their supposed specifications. With the benefit of hindsight, we can appreciate what a fine aircraft was evolving in the process. But at the time, eyebrows were being raised and there was considerable skepticism about the plane. On the 28th of May 1958, 3 years later than originally expected,
En mayo de 1958, la Fuerza Aérea recibió su primer F-105 operacional. Fue el único de este tipo en particular. Los pilotos de los bombarderos de la Fuerza Aérea se sintieron decepcionados al saber que su nueva ave era un bombardero de gran tamaño y lo descalificaron de entrada denominándolo despectivamente plomo, duro en la tormenta o simplemente el duro. Una vez que lo probaron, cambiaron de idea. El sobrenombre permaneció y el duro significaba invariablemente el F-105, pero ya no en un sentido peyorativo. El gran avión llegó a ser universalmente popular entre aquellos que lo volaron. No solo se desempeñaba como bombardero, sino que contenía una combinación de armas realmente aterradora. Completamente cargado, podía llevar 7.000 kilos de una gran variedad de armas, incluyendo todas las bombas normales, cohetes, cañones, paquetes electrónicos de contramedidas, misiles aire-superficie y misiles Sidewinder aire-aire.
Air-to-air missiles. But almost as the reason for its existence, the Thunder Chief also had a bomb bay. To minimize supersonic drag, the bomb bay doors retracted neatly into the plane. To control the ejection of the bomb, both for accuracy's sake and to ensure the bomb was clear of the aircraft, it was pushed down with a pneumatic rack. The rack was strong enough to be used as a jack to load the bay if there was no bomb trolley available. In wartime operations, however, the Thuds carried very few bombs internally. Most of the time, the bomb bay was occupied by a further reserve of fuel. On the outer wing, there was provision for 2 stores pylons to be fitted. These could be used to carry weaponry and fuel in any desired combination, or removed to allow the attachment of specialized delivery racks for other armaments, like this installation for the Sidewinder. The standard built-in armament of all Thunder Chief variants was a General Electric M61 20mm multi-barrel gun. This gun fired at 6,000 rounds per minute and could fire off the entire 1,029 shells it carried in less than 11 seconds. Air Force deliveries continue, with the 335th Tactical Air Squadron becoming the first fully equipped with the new fighter and celebrating by setting a world speed record.
En 1961 se hizo el primer despliegue sobre el Atlántico hacia las bases en Alemania.
Far away from Europe, the summer of 1964 saw the thuds go into action for the first time. Soon they were sporting new camouflage as they were deployed in larger numbers to bases in Thailand and South Vietnam. From those bases, they launched the campaigns that were to write their name into history. For the F-105, Vietnam was the right place at the right
Para el
time.
F-105, Vietnam era el lugar correcto en el momento correcto. Hasta entonces habían tenido problemas con la confiabilidad y en 1962 se habían desmovilizado.
Though those problems had been ironed out,
Aun cuando los problemas se habían resuelto, la plaga de accidentes y defectos menores continuó casi hasta sus primeras misiones en Vietnam. Allí los duros ganarían una reputación completamente diferente como avión confiable y duradero. También ganaron una reputación aterradora como armas. La importancia del Thunder Chief en Vietnam era clara. Durante los primeros 5 años volaron el 75% de las misiones de ataque de la Fuerza Aérea. Si los cielos de Vietnam estaban llenos de bombas, era porque los duros las colocaban allí.
If the skies of Vietnam were full of bombs, it was because thuds put them there.
Desde marzo de 1965 se hicieron numerosos ataques aéreos sobre Vietnam del Norte, enfocados primordialmente hacia flancos de comunicación. Dichos ataques descansaban casi completamente en los F-105. Los aviones despegaban con su carga de bombas para dirigirse al encuentro de un tanquero cerca de la frontera norvietnamita. Dado el nivel de almacenamiento externo que llevaban y la manera como tenían que volar a través de Vietnam antes que volar hacia o desde el flanco, su rango había disminuido considerablemente. Incluso con tanques llenos, los viajes no dejaban mucho de reserva. Además, volaban en un espacio aéreo hostil. Al principio de la guerra, los norvietnamitas tuvieron defensas aéreas limitadas y los primeros ataques fueron relativamente tranquilos. Sin embargo, muy pronto empezaron a multiplicarse los abastecimientos de artillería antiaérea, misiles tierra-aire y bombarderos MiG, y los ataques sucedían en las fauces de los sistemas más intensos de defensa aérea jamás experimentados en una guerra. Los duros explotaron puentes enemigos, carreteras, estacionamientos de camiones y bases militares, y los vietnamitas respondían a su vez con armas formidables. Aunque la pérdida de radio en los ataques individuales no podía considerarse crítica, para los Thunderbolts empezaba un proceso de desgaste lento que los reduciría a la mitad. Solo se construyeron 833 y casi 400 encontrarían su fin en Vietnam.
Production of the 105s had been completed in December 1964. Only 78 of the B model had been built. The majority, 610, had been F-105Ds. The D had acquired an extended nose in accommodating updated all-weather navigation systems, and thus was externally markedly dissimilar to the B. The other 143 were the twin-seat F model. It had always been expected that there would be a twin-seat version of the plane, but 2 earlier twin-seat proposals had been dropped. The Fs were to provide the stock for the later development of the last 105, the G, the Wild Weasel. The workhorse of the bombing raids was the D. The single-seaters abounded on the bases, where the work of war went on 24 hours a day. At the end of each mission, the returning pilot would confer with his crew chief about the performance of the plane and hand it over to him for service. The service record of the 105s in Vietnam was excellent. On any given day, over 90% of the thuds were ready for work. This figure was higher than the overall average within the USAF, and considering the complexity, workload and relative scarcity of the big planes, it's all the more outstanding. To keep them in the air, facilities for total maintenance of the planes were built at the bases they flew their missions from, and specialist teams were constantly available to fly in to handle specific problems. Teams of ground crew at the bases carried out the normal turnaround routines, like refueling, filling the water tank in the tail for the afterburner, rearming the plane, and the other servicing required between missions, quickly and efficiently. The body of the plane was a patchwork of hatches, allowing access to the equipment inside. The big fuselage had very little spare room inside it, but the layout was good enough to ensure that servicing was relatively straightforward. The bases were a far cry from the mud and improvisation of the Second World War. A Thunder Chief parked on Tak Lee's acres of hardstand could be serviced with relative ease. The wing point combinations for the next mission were selected and effected, and the plane armed in a smooth and practiced routine. A large part of the bombs dropped on Vietnam were iron bombs of Second World War vintage. Sadly, they were of a design philosophy and era that should have been long gone. However, modern smart bombs were not to really arrive in Vietnam until the F-111s used them in the last phases of the conflict. So the 105 missions were often flown to deliver hardware that was uncontrolled in flight, often unstable in trajectory, and sometimes unreliable in effect. But with these bombs, the thuds hammered the north, and in most instances, destroyed their allocated targets. Right through the night, the bases were a hive of activity as the work of repairing, servicing and arming the planes went on. Another factor that makes the 90% availability of the Thuds even more impressive was their toughness. They kept coming back from missions with major battle damage to repair. Thuds sustained strikes from SAMs, as well as AAA and MiG cannons, and survived. This one has actually been hit by a Sidewinder missile. Each morning, the one-man air forces waited, ready. In March 1965, the USAF flew the first of the Rolling Thunder series of strikes. The inclusion of the reference to Thunder is fitting, as throughout its 3 years, Rolling Thunder was to be the almost exclusive province of the Thunder Chief. The fuller extension of the air war into the north had 3 purposes. First, to reduce the infiltration of the south. Second, to give pause to the communist leadership in Hanoi. And thirdly, to bolster the morale of the southern leadership and the people of South Vietnam. As the name implies, the strikes rolled forward into the north, targets being progressively further and further over the border. And the thunder was real. The damage to the North's bridges and railways and roads exacted a great cost on the communists and hampered their war effort considerably. However, though at times apparently shaken, the Hanoi leadership did not break. The Thuds flew in on their deadly missions, and the Vietnamese tried, with everything the Russians and Chinese could give them, to knock them from the sky. North Vietnam was not an ideal target for a sustained bombing campaign. There was very little industrial infrastructure to damage and almost no war production. The country had an agrarian society, predominantly rural and dispersed. The few major targets in terms of docks and storage were within the exclusion zones around Hanoi and Haiphong, the 2 major cities. For political reasons, these areas were not bombed for most of the war, as the US consistently tried to negotiate an end to the fighting in the south. The Thud pilots learned their own ways of coping with the streams of SAMs that rose at them, splitting and diving to confuse and evade the missiles.
looks good. Okay, Detroit, listen, get out of here to the southwest.
En su encuentro con los MiG, los F-105 salieron bien librados. Tenían tal reserva de energía que si un MiG se las arreglaba para colocarse en posición de disparar, en la mayoría de los casos podían acelerar y escapar. Más aún, los duros eran capaces de cambiar las cosas para sus atacantes tomando la ofensiva. 28 MiGs fueron sepultados por los F-105. Las bombas continuaban lloviendo sobre Vietnam.
Supporting the bombing was an electronics and communications network of unprecedented technical sophistication. Operations controllers directed a huge fleet of varied craft in the air at every level from artillery spotter planes to B-52s. They dispatched rescue operations for downed pilots and coordinated the activities of tankers, bombers and fighters. Off the coast of North Vietnam prowled the Big Eye planes, packed with sensitive radar and alert for the slightest activity from the MiG squadrons. Any appearance of the MiGs was monitored and the information relayed to the fighters in the area. The constant observation, coupled with the air superiority of the Phantoms and Thunder Chiefs, served to ensure that for large periods of the war, the Communist Air Force stayed on the ground, pragmatically accepting that they could not compete. The controllers and their equipment directing the airstrikes were themselves part of a chain of command that stretched back from Vietnam through the Pacific headquarters in Hawaii all the way to Washington, where the targets were identified and authorized. At the very end of the chain were the thuds, setting off daily with their loads.
He's going to get going in a minute. Okay, I got him here.
Thousands and thousands of sorties succeeded one another, with the F-105 carrying most of the load. Whether or not one questions the strategic effect of the program, it is impossible to not acknowledge the burden that the Thunder Chiefs carried and the effectiveness with which they pursued their assignments. In June 1967, the first of the thuds to do so reached the halfway point in their theoretical 4,000-hour fatigue lifetime, to be followed soon by others. The most critical fatigue concern was the strains upon the engines. The missions that the thuds were flying were unlike anything originally envisaged. They were regularly running at full power with afterburner for extended periods of time. The stress on the power plants was enormous. The hot sections of the huge J-75 engine were particularly vulnerable to this type of treatment. Already there had been some shortages of spares. As a safeguard, the normal engine life between changes was reduced from 200 to 125 hours, and teams of mechanics worked on overhauling the engines, testing them and reinstalling them on the planes. By August 1968, the 388th Squadron was flying a Thunder Chief with 3,000 hours under its belt, having gone out on 500 missions, received flak damage on several occasions, and had been involved in a mid-air collision earlier in the year. By October, 3 more had passed the mark. They were growing old fast. An earlier suggestion to reopen the lines and build more F-105s had been considered, then dropped. There was a replacement for much of their work already available in the Phantom, and construction was proceeding apace on their successor, a design that had been much influenced by the story of the Thud and which reflected many of the lessons learnt in its combat life, the F-111. For the time being, the Thuds remained indispensable, and they were constantly tended to maintain their status and prolong their life. The Thuds remained in Vietnam to the end. Not only the 2-seater SAM-suppressing Wild Weasels, but also the Ds and Fs with their bombs, tactical support and electronic countermeasure systems. The Thuds were still workhorses, right through to the devastating Linebacker 1 and 2 operations that finally brought the North to a negotiating position that allowed the US to withdraw from the conflict. Their bombing had sustained the air war against North Vietnam. There was no other plane at the time that could have done the job. The bombing was fiercely pressed home and the results devastating, particularly when they were directed against a specific industrial target, as here on this truck maintenance depot. The Ho Chi Minh Trail buzzed with activity during the bombing hawks, with trucks bumper to bumper, illustrating 2 points: the wily resolve of the Vietnamese in pursuit of their aims, and the effectiveness of the bombing. With Thuds about, the trucks were far more circumspect. The pilot's tour of duty was 100 missions, and the Thuds saw hundreds of pilots through their tour and home again. They were men who were undoubtedly universally glad to be out of the war, glad to have done their job and survived. However, many of them were to miss their big machines and the sensation of howling through the air in a huge metal monster at twice the speed of sound. Captain John Piawati began growing his moustache when he first arrived in Vietnam in 1967. When he finished his 100th mission, the moustache was 12¼ inches long. On his 55th mission, his Thud was hit by artillery over the Paul Duma Bridge near Hanoi during a bombing run. His story is typical. Not only did he hit the bridge and bring down a span, but the damaged Thud brought him home to finish his tour. Some of the Wild Weasel and other specialist planes stayed with the USAF after Vietnam, but the 105s were progressively phased out and retired into the hands of the pilots of the Air Force Reserves. There were not too many of them about, and they faded rather quickly from use. The last reserve flight of an F-105 was on the 25th of May, 1983, exactly 25 years after the accident on the first flight of the F-105B.
Muchos pilotos se sentaron en la silla de un F-105 y regresaron vivos a casa. Muchos les deben la vida. Muchos consideran su avión como lo mejor del inventario. El gran bombardero creció a través de sus problemas de infancia y los parámetros de lo que se le podía pedir a un avión crecieron con él. Aún en esta época de múltiples transiciones, todo este diseño en un solo paquete es un logro sorprendente. Nunca hubo muchos de estos aviones y su reputación no se extendió. Pero si la denominación Gran Aeroplano puede asignarse a algún avión, ciertamente tiene que ser al F-105 Thunderchief, el duro.